The doghouse plea the Arizona evening was heavy with heat, the kind that lingers even after the sun begins to sink behind the desert horizon, painting the sky with streaks of orange, red, and purple. And though the neighborhood was one of quiet luxury, with wide, clean streets lined with towering palms and houses that looked more like palaces than homes, one figure stood out against the perfection of the manicured lawns and iron gates. Her name was Sophie Whitman, and at just 10 years old she carried herself like someone who had lived far longer, her small frame bent beneath the invisible weight of years of loss and worry. Her shoes were too large, clearly given to her second hand, and the soles were so thin they barely separated her feet from the hot concrete beneath them. In her hands, she clutched a backpack that seemed older than she was, its faded fabric frayed at the edges, one strap repaired with string. That bag contained everything she had left in the world: 2 shirts, a worn notebook where she sometimes scribbled words when she could find a pencil, and a single photograph of a woman who smiled but had long since disappeared from her life. Sophie stood outside the black iron gate of a mansion locals always whispered about, her wide brown eyes reflecting both fear and desperate hope. The mansion belonged to Deshaun Ellington, a man whose name had become synonymous with success in Phoenix. Everyone in the area knew his story, though the versions they told varied. Some said he was a genius in real estate who had turned rundown properties into gold, while others believed he had been ruthless in his rise to wealth. Some admired him for his drive, while others muttered bitterly that he had forgotten the struggle from which he came. But none of that mattered to Sophie, who knew nothing of boardrooms or real estate empires. What she knew was that beyond this gate stood safety, perhaps only in the form of a doghouse at the edge of a vast backyard. But to her, even that would mean more than the concrete steps of a bus stop or the shadows of an alley. She was tired of pretending to sleep in stairwells to avoid the gaze of strangers, tired of being turned away from shelters that claimed to be full, tired of waiting for a mother who had promised she would return but never did. Sophie pressed her small fingers around the cold bars of the gate and whispered a plea so soft that even she wasn't sure it carried beyond the iron. "Please, sir, can I stay here, even if it's just in your doghouse?" At first, nothing answered but the sounds of the city beyond the walls, the hum of distant traffic, the echo of a dog barking somewhere down the block, the faint rustle of palm fronds as the desert wind stirred them. Her heart thudded in her chest, each beat echoing louder than the last, her body tense as she imagined the possibilities. No one would hear her, or worse, someone would, and they would laugh at her or yell at her to leave. She thought of all the times she had been told she was nothing but trouble, all the faces that had turned away when she asked for help, and she braced herself for another rejection. Then, the sound of footsteps echoed from the driveway, slow and steady, confident in their rhythm, and Sophie's breath caught in her throat. From around the corner of the tall stucco walls appeared a tall figure, his presence commanding even before his face came into view. He wore a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled up against the heat, his skin a deep brown that glowed faintly beneath the fading sunlight, and his stride was purposeful, the kind of walk belonging to a man who carried authority wherever he went. Keys jingled in his hand as he approached, his gaze narrowing when it fell on the small figure clinging to his gate. Deshaun Ellington stopped short, his brow furrowed, not in anger, but in confusion. He had expected to find delivery men a lost pet, maybe even one of the neighbors who sometimes had the audacity to treat his driveway as a shortcut, but never this. Never a child whose eyes carried both exhaustion and an unspoken plea. "What did you just say?" His voice was deep, calm, edged with disbelief, the sound carrying across the quiet evening air. Sophie swallowed hard, her throat dry, her hands tightening around her backpack straps as though holding on to them could anchor her in this moment. She forced herself to speak louder, though her voice trembled. "I don't need much, sir. Just somewhere safe. I can sleep in your doghouse, please." The words hung between them heavier than the desert heat, pressing down with the weight of her desperation. Across the street, a woman walking her golden retriever slowed her pace, pretending to fuss with her dog's leash while her eyes flicked curiously toward the gate. A man jogging by slowed his stride, earbuds dangling around his neck as though waiting to see what would unfold. It wasn't just Sophie holding her breath now. It was the whole block, the quiet neighborhood suddenly electrified by the strangeness of this scene. A millionaire at his gates, and a homeless child asking for shelter in a doghouse. Deshaun stared at her, his mind racing even as his body remained still. He saw the dirt smudged on her jeans, the tangled strands of hair falling over her face, the oversized shoes that flopped slightly when she shifted her weight. But what struck him most were her eyes, large, vulnerable, and heavy with a kind of sorrow he recognized all too well. For a moment, the sight of her pulled him backward through time, away from the polished success he lived in now, to a one-bedroom apartment on the south side of Tucson, where he had grown up as the eldest of 3 boys raised by a mother who worked herself to the bone just to keep the lights on. He remembered the gnawing of hunger, the fear of eviction, the shame of hand-me-down clothes that never quite fit, and the endless prayers whispered into the dark for a miracle that rarely came. Every inch of the mansion behind him had been built on years of sweat, sacrifice, and determination. But seeing Sophie was like staring into a mirror of the boy he once was, a reflection of a life he had fought so hard to leave behind. Lowering himself slightly, he rested his hand on the iron gate and let his voice soften, though curiosity still edged his tone. "Kid, where are your mom and dad?" Sophie lowered her gaze, her voice breaking as she answered. "My mom said she'd come back." "But she didn't, and my dad?" She hesitated, fiddling with the strap of her bag. "I don't even know where he is." Deshawn exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening as he rubbed the back of his neck. This was not a situation he was used to. Business negotiations, real estate deals, money problems, those he could solve with ease. But a little girl at his gate asking to sleep in his doghouse was not something he had ever been trained for. From across the street, the woman with the retriever raised her voice just enough to carry over the silence. "Mr. Ellington, you don't need to get involved. Call the police or child services. That's not your problem." Sophie's cheeks flushed with humiliation and she hugged her backpack tighter to her chest, staring at the ground as though trying to disappear. She had expected rejection, but hearing it voiced aloud from a stranger burned worse than silence. Deshawn didn't respond right away. Instead, he studied the girl, the tension in her small shoulders, the trembling in her hands. He could feel the eyes of the neighbors watching, waiting to see what the millionaire would do, and in that moment it wasn't just Sophie being judged, it was him. His decision, whatever it was, would not just define this night but ripple outward, changing how people saw him, and perhaps how he saw himself. The air seemed to thicken, every second stretching longer than the last, until finally, Deshawn placed his keys in his pocket and crouched down further so he was closer to Sophie's height. His expression remained unreadable, but his next words would soon shock not only Sophie, but the entire neighborhood that had been holding its breath. The millionaire's dilemma. Deshawn Ellington stood at the gate for what felt like an eternity, though in reality only a few moments had passed. The neighbors continued to glance over, pretending they were only out for an evening stroll with their pets, but their ears strained to catch every word. Sophie's fragile voice still echoed in his mind, the plea so simple yet so heavy that it pressed against the edges of his chest like a weight he couldn't shake off. She hadn't asked for a meal. She hadn't asked for money. She hadn't even dared to dream of a bed inside the mansion that loomed behind him. She had asked for a doghouse, a space meant for animals, because to her it still meant safety. It meant shelter. It meant a chance to sleep without fear. That request told Deshawn more about her life than 1,000 words could have. It told him she was used to being overlooked, to being unwanted, to expecting rejection so often that she had lowered her standards of hope to the bare minimum. The little girl's eyes shifted nervously between his face and the ground, as if she was preparing for him to call the police or wave her away like so many others had. He could see the way her hands clutched the straps of her tattered backpack, as though it was the only anchor keeping her steady. That backpack probably held everything she owned in the world, maybe a change of clothes, maybe a piece of bread, maybe nothing at all. He remembered when he too had carried everything he owned in one small bag, when life had offered him no guarantees except the certainty of struggle. Memories flashed in his mind of his mother coming home late, her uniform stained with sweat and exhaustion, placing leftovers from a diner's closing shift on the table with a tired smile. He remembered lying awake in their cramped apartment, listening to his younger brother's stomachs growl, trying to pretend he wasn't hungry so they could take the bigger share. Now here he was, standing in front of a mansion worth millions, dressed in a tailored suit, with cars in his garage worth more than his mother had earned in a year. Success had carried him far from those lean years, but the sight of Sophie standing before him was a mirror reflecting the boy he used to be. The boy who knew what it was like to be invisible. And though he had built a wall around himself in this wealthy neighborhood, where people saw him as either an anomaly or an outsider. He felt that wall begin to crack as he looked into Sophie's tired eyes. "Where is your mother?" he asked again, softer this time, though his voice still carried the authority of a man who was used to having questions answered. Sophie shifted on her feet, her oversized shoes slapping against the sidewalk. She raised her chin just enough to speak, her voice trembling but clear. "She said she would come back for me. But she didn't. It's been weeks. I waited at the place she told me to stay, but the people there said they couldn't keep me anymore. I don't know where she is." Deshawn's jaw tightened. The honesty in her words left no space for doubt. She wasn't rehearsing a story to trick him. She wasn't angling for pity. She was simply telling the truth in the only way a child could, raw and without pretense. He glanced across the street where Mrs. Hamilton still stood with her arms folded, lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Her voice carried across the road again. "Mr. Ellington, this is not your responsibility. Call the authorities. Let them handle it." The word authorities rang in his ears like a cold metal clang. He knew what authorities often meant for children like Sophie. He had seen too many kids bounced from one foster home to another, shuffled like burdens instead of nurtured like children. He remembered one boy he grew up with, Daniel, who had gone through 4 foster homes by the time he was 12. By the time they saw him again at 17, his eyes had hardened into stone and his smile had disappeared. Deshawn had sworn that if he ever had the power, he would make sure fewer kids faced that fate. And now the universe was testing him to see if those words had meant anything. He turned back to Sophie. "You can't just sleep in a doghouse," he said carefully, his deep voice wrapping around her like both a warning and a reassurance. Sophie nodded quickly, as if she had expected that answer, her shoulders already bracing to walk away. But before she could take a step, Deshawn continued. "If you really have nowhere else to go, then at least let me give you something better than that." His words hung in the air, and Sophie froze. She looked up, her wide eyes filled with confusion, hope, and fear all at once. Deshawn unlocked the gate with a soft click, the sound startling in the silence of the block. The iron bars swung open and he gestured for her to step inside. Sophie's feet hesitated on the pavement as though invisible chains held her back. No one had ever opened a gate for her before. No one had ever welcomed her into a place that looked like a castle. Behind her, Mrs. Hamilton gasped audibly, muttering something about mistakes and bad influence. The couple walking their golden retriever paused to exchange whispers. Everyone was watching. Deshawn didn't care. His focus remained on the girl in front of him. Sophie stepped forward slowly, her oversized shoes making her stumble slightly, until she crossed the threshold of the gate. For a moment she looked back at the street as though expecting someone to yank her back, but no one moved. She was inside. She was safe, at least for tonight. Deshawn closed the gate behind her and the sound was final, like a decision sealed. They walked together toward the mansion, the gravel crunching beneath their steps. Sophie's eyes darted everywhere, at the manicured lawn, the fountain in the courtyard, the polished stone of the mansion walls. It was a world she had only glimpsed in passing, never imagined stepping into. Her hand brushed against the side of her backpack as though to remind herself she was still carrying her reality with her, no matter how surreal this felt. Inside, the cool air wrapped around her like a blanket. The scent of polished wood and faint cologne filled the space, and the glow of warm light softened the high ceilings and wide halls. Sophie's eyes widened at the sheer size of the entrance hall alone. It was bigger than the entire shelter she had stayed in last month. Deshawn motioned toward the living room, and she followed cautiously, afraid to touch anything, as if the walls themselves might shatter if she leaned too hard. Deshawn stood in the doorway, watching her. He could see her awe, but he could also see the layers of caution. Trust was not something she gave freely, not after the life she had lived. He walked toward the kitchen and returned with a glass of water and a plate of food. Nothing extravagant, just some leftover chicken and rice from dinner. But when he placed it in front of her, Sophie's eyes shimmered with tears. She whispered a thank you, barely audible, and then ate with the kind of hunger that comes from too many skipped meals. Deshawn leaned back, his arms crossed loosely over his chest, and studied her. Every bite she took reminded him of the boy he once was, the boy who ate fast because he wasn't sure when the next meal would come. He felt something stir inside him that he hadn't felt in years, a responsibility beyond himself, beyond his wealth. He thought of all the people who had doubted him when he was young, who had told him he would never escape poverty. What if someone had given him a chance back then? How much easier might his journey have been? As Sophie finished her plate, she glanced up nervously, perhaps expecting him to take it away or tell her she had overstayed her welcome. Instead, he asked quietly, "What's in the backpack?" She hesitated, then slowly unzipped it. Inside were a few crumpled clothes, a stuffed rabbit with one ear missing, and a small notebook. She pulled the rabbit out first, hugging it close, then showed him the notebook. The pages were filled with childish handwriting, little drawings of houses, gardens, and smiling families. She pointed to one picture of a simple house with flowers by the door. "This is where I want to live one day," she said softly, almost embarrassed. Deshawn felt a lump rise in his throat. She wasn't asking for riches. She wasn't asking for toys or luxuries. She just wanted a home, a place where she could belong. He nodded slowly, his mind already turning with possibilities. But he also knew the world wouldn't make it easy. If word got out that he had taken in a homeless girl, there would be questions, scrutiny, perhaps even accusations. The wealthy neighbors who already whispered about him would sharpen their knives. The authorities might come knocking. And yet, as he looked at Sophie holding her rabbit, her eyes still carrying shadows of fear, he knew he couldn't turn her away. Not now. Not ever. That night, Sophie slept in a guest room that was larger than any space she had ever known. Deshawn stood at the doorway, watching her, breathing steady as sleep claimed her. She had asked for a doghouse, and he had given her a bed. But as he closed the door gently, he realized the true challenge was only beginning. This was no simple act of kindness that ended in one night. This was the start of something that would change both their lives forever. And outside, beyond the iron gates, the neighbors kept whispering. Tomorrow, the whole block would know, and soon the city would hear about the millionaire who let a homeless girl into his mansion. Some would praise him, some would condemn him, but none of them would ever forget the story that had just begun. A home filled with memories. The sun had long disappeared behind the Arizona horizon, leaving only a soft glow that painted the desert sky in fading streaks of purple and orange. Inside the mansion, the stillness of night wrapped itself around the halls, but in one of the guest rooms a child lay curled under blankets, her breathing steady at last. For the first time in weeks, Sophie did not fall asleep in fear of someone waking her to move, or in worry about being chased away from a corner she tried to claim as her own. The bed was soft, the sheets smelled faintly of lavender, and for a little while she allowed herself to believe she was safe. The stuffed rabbit rested against her cheek, its missing ear no longer a reminder of loss but a comfort, because it had survived with her through everything. Deshawn stood quietly at the door, arms folded, watching her. He told himself he was only making sure she was comfortable, that he was only checking that she wasn't frightened. But the truth was, he was wrestling with thoughts heavier than any real estate deal he had ever made. He had built empires out of concrete and steel, yet here in front of him was a situation with no blueprint, no contract, and no guarantee of success. Bringing Sophie into his house had been instinct, a decision born from a moment of recognition that he could not ignore. But what next? Could he protect her from the world, from the questions that would surely follow? Could he protect himself from the whispers already starting to stir in the neighborhood? He turned away from the room at last, pulling the door nearly shut, though he left it cracked just enough to hear if she needed him. Downstairs, the house was silent. The marble floors reflected the dim lights above. The glass windows caught faint glimpses of the moon, and the stillness felt heavier than usual. Deshawn poured himself a glass of water and sat at the dining table, his mind running through memories he had long buried. He remembered the tiny apartment where he grew up, where 3 brothers shared one mattress on the floor. He remembered the creak of the radiator, the smell of his mother's weary hands after she came home from work, and the ache in his chest when she cried quietly at night, thinking the children were asleep. He remembered swearing that one day he would make sure no one in his family would ever feel that kind of hunger again, and he had kept that promise. He had worked his way through construction sites, his hands blistered and scarred, until he learned enough to buy, sell, and build on his own. The mansion around him was proof of his success, but what good was all of it if he turned his back on a child who stood at his gate asking only for a doghouse? The next morning, sunlight filled the halls. Sophie woke with a start, disoriented at first by the sheer size of the room. For a moment, panic surged through her. She wasn't used to ceilings this high or sheets this soft. But then she saw the rabbit beside her. The same rabbit she had held every night on the street, and she remembered. She was inside, she was safe, at least for now. She slid out of bed, her feet sinking into the thick rug, and wandered to the window. Outside, the garden stretched in perfect lines of trimmed bushes and colorful flowers, the kind she had only seen in parks where security guards made sure kids like her didn't linger too long. She pressed her hand to the glass as if to test if this was real. When she crept downstairs, Deshawn was already in the kitchen, dressed casually for once in a plain t-shirt and jeans. The smell of fresh coffee lingered, though beside it sat a plate of pancakes and scrambled eggs. Sophie froze in the doorway, unsure if the food was meant for her. She had lived too long with scraps and leftovers to believe such a meal could be hers. Deshawn noticed her hesitation and nodded toward the chair. "Go on, sit down. That's for you." His tone was steady, almost businesslike, as though he wanted to make the moment less overwhelming for her. Sophie slid into the chair and stared at the plate for a long moment before taking a bite. It was warm, fluffy, and unlike anything she had tasted in months. She tried to eat slowly, though her instincts made her want to finish quickly, in case someone took it away. Deshawn sipped his coffee, watching her with the quiet patience of a man who knew this was not about food but about trust. He asked gentle questions. Where she had been before, what she liked to do, what she wanted for herself. Sophie's answers were short, cautious, but honest. She liked to draw. She wanted to be a teacher. And she hated the sound of sirens because they reminded her of nights when the world felt dangerous. Each answer sank into Deshawn like a seed, planting thoughts of what her life could be if someone nurtured her dreams instead of letting them wither. Later that day, Deshawn gave Sophie a tour of the mansion. Every room they entered made her pause in awe, not because of the wealth displayed, but because of the little details she noticed. The family photos on the wall, most of them of Deshawn with his late mother or his brothers, told stories she wanted to hear. The study lined with books made her eyes light up, and she whispered that she used to read at the library until they closed, pretending she was just waiting for someone so they wouldn't ask her to leave. In the music room, she pressed a finger against the keys of the grand piano, the sound so pure it startled her into a giggle. Deshawn found himself smiling for the first time in days, because her joy reminded him of something he had forgotten, that life wasn't only about building wealth. It was about filling homes with memories worth keeping, but outside those walls the world was already stirring. Neighbors whispered about what they had seen at the gate, and rumors spread faster than truth. Some said Deshawn had gone mad, letting a homeless child into his home. Others claimed he was being taken advantage of. A few, though fewer than he hoped, praised him quietly for doing what others would never dare. By evening, Deshawn received a call from a colleague who had heard chatter in town. "You're drawing attention, man," the voice warned. "Be careful. People love to twist stories." Deshawn hung up and stared at the phone for a long time, realizing that the choice he had made was not going to remain private. That night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Deshawn walked through the quiet halls and felt the weight of expectation pressing in on him. He knew the authorities could become involved at any moment, and he knew the neighbors would not stay silent. But when he peeked into Sophie's room and saw her sleeping peacefully with the rabbit tucked under her chin, he also knew he could not send her back into the streets. This child had asked for a doghouse, and instead he had given her a bed. That act had already bound them together in a way that was difficult to explain. Yet deep inside, Deshawn also sensed something else. This was not going to be simple. Sophie's past was not gone, and the world would demand answers. Somewhere out there was a mother who had vanished, a truth about why Sophie had ended up alone, and questions about whether she truly belonged in this house. And Deshawn understood that those questions would not only shape Sophie's future, but test the strength of his own resolve. As the lights dimmed and the mansion settled into silence again, Deshawn whispered to himself, almost like a promise carried into the night. "If the world wants to fight me on this, then let it. She won't be alone again." But what neither of them knew was that Sophie's story was about to pull them into trials far deeper than either expected. Trials that would reveal not only her hidden pain but also the limits of Deshawn's courage. Trials and truths the following week unfolded like the slow build of a storm. At first there were only faint whispers, hushed conversations between neighbors walking their dogs or watering their lawns, but whispers when carried from porch to porch and phone call to phone call, had a way of swelling into something larger than truth. Soon everyone in the wealthy Phoenix subdivision knew that Deshaun Ellington, the black millionaire who lived behind the iron gates, had taken in a little girl from the street. Some called it charity, others called it reckless, and more than a few spoke of it with suspicion. The sight of Sophie's small figure walking across the garden or peeking curiously out of a window was enough to fuel more speculation than Deshaun could keep up with. At first, Deshaun ignored it. He had faced worse in his life. Men doubting him on construction sites, bankers dismissing him in boardrooms, competitors sneering at him as if he didn't belong in the circles he had fought so hard to enter. Rumors had never built nor broken his fortune, but this was different. This was not about his name or his business. This was about Sophie, a child already fragile from years of abandonment. And though he tried to shield her from it, he knew that the walls of his mansion were not strong enough to keep out the whispers. One afternoon, as Sophie sat at the dining table with her notebook, sketching another drawing of a simple house with flowers at the doorbell rang. Deshaun opened it to find two officials standing on the porch, their badges clear against their shirts. Child Protective Services. The call had come sooner than he expected. The taller of the two spoke first, his tone polite but firm. "Mr. Ellington, we've received reports that a minor is residing here under your care. We need to ask some questions." Deshaun's jaw clenched, but he stepped aside, allowing them in. Sophie stiffened the moment she saw the strangers, clutching her rabbit as if it were a shield. Her wide eyes darted toward Deshaun, silently asking if she had done something wrong. He crouched beside her, resting a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's all right, kid. Just answer their questions honestly." The questions, however, were heavy. Where were her parents? How long had she been without them? Did she feel safe here? Sophie's answers came out haltingly, each word carrying the weight of a truth too big for her small frame. Her mother had promised to come back but never did. Her father was gone long before she could remember. She had been turned away from the shelter. And yes, she felt safe here. Safer than anywhere else. The officials exchanged looks, jotting notes. One of them pulled Deshaun aside. "We understand your intentions, sir, but you must realize the legal complications. Without guardianship or foster approval, you cannot simply take a child into your home. This could escalate quickly." Deshaun's patience cracked. His voice, though controlled, carried a sharp edge. "So what was I supposed to do? Leave her outside my gate? Let her crawl into a doghouse while I sit in my mansion with empty rooms?" The official's silence was answer enough. They promised to return for follow-up, and as they left, Deshaun saw Mrs. Hamilton across the street watching with a look of grim satisfaction. She had made the call, of course. To her, compassion was weakness, and appearances mattered more than humanity. That evening, Sophie retreated to her room, quiet and withdrawn. Deshaun knocked gently before stepping inside. She sat on the edge of the bed, her rabbit in her lap, her eyes downcast. "Are they going to take me away?" she asked, her voice breaking. Deshaun knelt in front of her, his gaze steady. "Not if I can help it. You belong here now, Sophie. You're not alone anymore." The words came from a place deeper than promise. They came from conviction, born of every night he had once spent wondering if someone would fight for him. But fate had more trials in store. 2 days later, as Deshaun returned from a business meeting, he found a woman standing at his gate. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes worn, and her eyes carried both guilt and defiance. Sophie's mother. The moment Sophie saw her through the window, her small body froze, the rabbit slipping from her grasp. The reunion she had dreamed of for weeks no longer felt like salvation. It felt like fear. The woman introduced herself with a trembling voice, explaining that she had fallen on hard times, that she had meant to return for her daughter, that she just needed another chance. But Deshaun's sharp instincts told him there was more to the story. He asked where she had been, why she had left Sophie alone. The answers were vague, filled with excuses about jobs lost and people who had promised help but never came through. What she didn't know was that Sophie had told him everything. The days of waiting, the empty promises, the abandonment too cruel to be explained away. When Sophie's mother reached for her, Sophie flinched. The child who had once longed for her mother's return now hid behind Deshaun's frame, her small hand clutching his as if it were the only anchor she trusted. In that moment, the truth hung heavy in the air. Sometimes blood ties could not undo betrayal, and sometimes family was found, not given. The situation escalated into a legal battle faster than Deshawn anticipated. Court dates were scheduled, lawyers were hired, and the media caught wind of the story. Headlines painted it with dramatic strokes. Millionaire takes in homeless girl. Mother returns to claim custody. Cameras appeared outside the mansion gates, reporters hungry for sound bites. To some, Deshawn was a hero. To others, a man overstepping his place. For Sophie, it was another storm threatening to pull her back into the world she had escaped. In court, Sophie's voice trembled as she clutched her rabbit and told the judge what had happened. She spoke of nights spent waiting for her mother who never came, of shelters that turned her away, of hunger that gnawed at her stomach. And then she spoke of Deshawn, of the bed he gave her, the food he offered, the way he listened without judgment. "He didn't treat me like a problem," she whispered. "He treated me like I mattered." The courtroom was silent. Even the judge leaned forward, his pen pausing mid-note. Across the aisle, Sophie's mother looked down, unable to meet her daughter's eyes. Deshawn, seated beside Sophie, felt pride surge through him. Not for himself, but for the bravery of the small girl who had asked only for a doghouse and had instead found her voice. The judge did not deliver a final decision that day, postponing for further review. But as Deshawn walked out of the courthouse holding Sophie's hand, he knew the battle was not just about custody. It was about proving that love, stability, and compassion outweighed excuses and neglect. And though the path ahead promised more scrutiny, more whispers, and more trials, he also knew this truth. Sophie had become more than a responsibility. She had become family. That night, as the city lights glimmered in the distance and the weight of the day pressed heavy on his shoulders, Deshawn whispered the same promise he had made before. "You won't be alone again." And this time Sophie believed him. She clutched his hand tighter, her small voice steady as she replied, "I know." But the storm was not over. The world was still watching, waiting to see what choice Deshawn would make next. And the answer he would give, an answer not just in words but in action, would soon shock everyone far beyond that neighborhood in Phoenix. The answer that shocked everyone. The weeks that followed felt like living under a magnifying glass. Every move Deshawn made seemed to be dissected by neighbors, reporters, and strangers who suddenly had an opinion on his life. Some praised him for stepping in when no one else did, while others criticized him, questioning his motives and warning him that good intentions were never enough in a world bound by laws and appearances. For Sophie, the mansion became both sanctuary and prison, a place of safety surrounded by constant voices of doubt pressing against the iron gates. Yet through it all she clung to Deshawn, and he clung to his promise that she would never be alone again. The second court hearing arrived on a gray morning. Rain threatened but held back, leaving the sky heavy and uncertain as if even nature was waiting to see what the outcome would be. Deshawn walked into the courthouse with Sophie at his side, her small hand clasping his so tightly that he felt the strength of her determination through the tremble of her fingers. She wore a simple dress he had bought her. Nothing extravagant, just something that made her feel clean and proud. The stuffed rabbit was tucked under her arm, its faded fur a reminder of all she had endured. The cameras outside flashed as they passed, reporters shouting questions that neither of them answered. Inside, the courtroom was packed, every seat filled with faces hungry for a story. Sophie's mother was already there, seated with a lawyer who spoke in clipped tones about rights, responsibilities, and second chances. She looked fragile and restless, her eyes darting between the floor and her daughter. When her gaze finally landed on Sophie, there was a flicker of recognition, of regret, but it was quickly swallowed by the pressure of the proceedings. The lawyer argued that the mother deserved another chance, that people make mistakes, that families should be reunited whenever possible. He painted a picture of a woman who had been broken by circumstances and was now ready to rebuild. Deshawn's lawyer responded with facts. Sophie had been left alone, had been denied shelter, had been forced to beg for a place in a doghouse. He spoke of stability, of consistency, of the basic human need for a safe home. But the most powerful moment did not come from either lawyer. It came when Sophie herself was asked to speak again. She stood slowly, her rabbit pressed against her chest, and lifted her gaze to the judge. Her voice shook at first, but then steadied with every word. She told the story not as a lawyer would, but as only a child could. She spoke of nights on cold concrete, of waiting in vain for her mother, of hunger that made her cry when no one was looking. She spoke of the day she knocked on the gate and asked only for a doghouse, because she didn't think she deserved more. And then she spoke of Deshaun, the man who gave her food, who gave her a bed, who listened when she was afraid. He didn't just give me a house, she whispered. He gave me a home. He made me feel like I matter. I don't want to lose that. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the reporter scribbling notes paused to look up. The judge leaned back in his chair, studying the child who had spoken with more truth than all the arguments combined. Across the room, Sophie's mother wept quietly, her tears betraying the words her lawyer tried to gather. Deshaun, seated beside Sophie, felt his chest tighten with pride, sorrow, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. When the judge finally spoke, his tone was deliberate. He acknowledged the mother's struggles, the weight of poverty and hardship that had led her astray. But he also acknowledged the evidence of neglect, the danger of repeating past mistakes, and the undeniable bond Sophie had formed with Deshaun. Children, the judge said, need more than promises. They need presence. They need consistency. They need love shown not in words but in action. Then he turned his gaze toward Deshaun. Mr. Ellington, by taking this child into your home, you have assumed a role that carries weight beyond charity. It carries responsibility, and though the road ahead will not be simple, this court recognizes that Sophie's best interests are served by remaining under your guardianship. The words struck the room like a bell. Gasps rippled through the crowd, cameras clicked furiously, and Sophie's mother sobbed openly, her shoulders shaking. Deshaun closed his eyes for a moment, the relief washing over him like a tide he had been holding back for too long. When he opened them, Sophie was already climbing into his lap, her small arms wrapping around his neck with a strength far greater than her size. He whispered into her hair, "You're home now, kid. For good." The news spread quickly, traveling faster than gossip ever could. By the evening, headlines across Arizona carried the story. Millionaire given guardianship of homeless girl who asked to sleep in doghouse. Some criticized the court's decision, but far more celebrated it. Strangers mailed letters of support. Churches offered donations, and people who had never met Deshaun praised his courage for choosing compassion over convenience. For Sophie, the mansion no longer felt like a place she didn't belong. It became her home, filled not with marble and glass, but with warmth and belonging. Life did not become perfect overnight. There were still challenges, papers to sign, adjustments to make, routines to build. But with every passing day, Sophie grew stronger, her laughter echoing through the halls like a song the house had never heard before. Deshaun discovered that her joy filled the mansion in a way wealth never had. He found himself sitting at the piano with her, helping her press the keys, listening as she laughed at the strange sounds. He watched her draw houses with more and more flowers in the gardens, her dreams no longer confined to the margins of a worn notebook. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Sophie curled against him with her rabbit. She looked up and asked a question that caught him off guard. "Why did you let me stay when I only asked for a doghouse?" Deshaun thought for a moment, then smiled, his deep voice carrying the truth he had come to understand. "Because you deserved more than what you asked for. Sometimes we think we only deserve scraps, but the truth is we all deserve love, safety, and a place to call home. And you, Sophie, deserve all of that and more." Her eyes glistened as she whispered, "Thank you." Then she leaned her head against his chest, and for the first time in her young life, she fell asleep knowing that tomorrow would not bring another rejection, but another day in a home that was hers. Outside the mansion, the neighborhood had grown quieter. The same neighbors who once whispered now waved politely at Sophie as she played in the garden. Some even stopped to talk. Their curiosity softened into admiration, and though not everyone approved, it no longer mattered. The world had been shocked not by scandal but by compassion, and that was an answer louder than any rumor. Deshaun often thought back to that night at the gate, the small voice asking for a doghouse. He knew he would never forget it, because it was the moment that reminded him of who he had been, who he had become, and who he was meant to be. Success had built him a mansion, but Sophie had built him a home, and together they carried a story that would inspire far beyond Phoenix. A story about how the smallest plea could awaken the greatest act of humanity.